Good afternoon, and welcome to the Strategic and Political Turmoil panel. We've assembled a group of industry veterans and commentators to discuss a topic that keeps many executives up at night. Global political turmoil continues to dominate headlines. Each year we think things will settle down, but we seem to experience a political earthquake every few months. The latest, of course, is the Russian threat toward Ukraine, as well as accelerating Chinese moves against Taiwan. Throw in the continuing superpower rivalry between the US and China, and sideshows like the Australia-China coal dispute, and it looks like the world is teetering on the brink. Meanwhile, the global political effort to reduce carbon emissions has put great pressure on shipping operations and has changed the way company managers think. And efforts by governments to combat money laundering and tax evasion have led to clampdowns on offshore jurisdictions popular with ship owners. The shipping industry, though, keeps moving forward, finding ways to adapt to changing circumstances. Indeed, shipping often thrives in chaos and turmoil. And during the last year, that's been very chaotic. We've seen the once beleaguered container market turn red hot. So we have lots to discuss, and we'll see what our panelists see in their crystal balls. This year, we're privileged to have with us, we'll start with alphabetically, Bill Antholis. Bill has served as the director and CEO of the Miller Center of Public Affairs, a nonpartisan research center at the University of Virginia, for the last 7 years. Before that, Bill was managing director of the Brookings Institution and served in several positions during the Clinton administration in the National Security Council and the State Department. Marina Tzoutzouraki is joining us from the Netherlands. She's well known to many in our audience as the co-founder and chief financial officer of eShipFinance.com. Marina also acts as a consultant for shipping investment and financing. Previously, she held numerous senior positions in shipping finance at Banca Franco-Hellenic and Eurobank in Greece. And Rockford Weitz is professor of practice, entrepreneur coach, and director of the Maritime Studies program at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. He's also the president of the Institute for Global Maritime Studies, a nonprofit seeking practical solutions to global maritime challenges. And he was the founder and CEO of Cargometrics. He is also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. So let's get started with some of the global hotspots. The elephant in the room seems to be the Russia-Ukraine situation. Both countries border on the Black Sea, and the turmoil over there, among other things, may be driving up the price of oil. So let's go to Rocky first with this question. Do you foresee a Russian invasion of Ukraine? And if so, what are the consequences that you see, particularly for shipping, but generally as well?
Great question. In some ways, they've already invaded, and it's just been a hybrid war. And so we'll see. I can't predict what Vladimir Putin will do. But let's just, for the sake of conversation, say that he did take part of the Donbass at least, or maybe take enough of eastern Ukraine to connect with the Crimean Peninsula. What would that do to oil and gas markets? I think it would destabilize them. Prices would likely go up. We may see some rerouting of oil and LNG to European terminals that had the capacity to import. I think you described it as the elephant in the room. I think there's probably 3 elephants in the room, which is why 2022 is so challenging. I would say the second order consequence of any kind of Russian action in Ukraine would be an increased likelihood of something happening in the Taiwan Straits area, maybe something happening on the Korean Peninsula, and maybe something happening in the Strait of Hormuz. And it would make 2020 look like a stable year for global shipping. So we'll see. It's shaping up to be the most interesting year to study maritime geopolitics. I told that to my students this morning, and I think that's the case right now.
Bill, you've monitored the Biden administration closely. What do you see as a likely U.S. response to Russian aggression and consequences?
Well, John, thank you for having me, and it's great to be with these 2 other terrific panelists. I think the Biden administration is thinking about a number of different possible responses, even within the sanctions regime, which is a set of those responses. It's not actually limited to sanctions, but it's certainly a set. Which sanctions are just as important as whether or not sanctions. So, they could sanction, for instance, Russia's access to SWIFT and the global financial clearinghouse. That would be very, very dramatic. And I think the most recent currents are that they're probably doing more targeted sanctions aimed at a few Russian banks and probably some Russian leaders, deeper sanctions on some Russian leaders, which in the past have been effective. But as Rocky mentioned, the ramifications of what happens there are not just what happens there, which themselves could be global, energy supply lines, the impact on global energy prices, both gas and oil, but also how any response, including sanctions and other responses, are perceived in China or in the Straits. So I think the Biden administration is weighing all these things as well as what their allies are willing to do. The last thing that I'd say, which I actually think is really quite interesting in this regard, is challenges lead to opportunities. I think going to the Taiwan Straits issue, and not to jump ahead too much, but you'll recall that when the Trump administration came in, they got rid of the PPP, the Pacific Partnership, which was essentially the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a trade agreement essentially among like-minded, largely democratic nations. One could see a deepening network of economic ties among democracies, which actually over a middle to longer term could actually increase trade among those countries. Just to give you a small example of that, in East Asia, one could imagine that TPP coming back up again. Already we're seeing American investment because of the deepening tensions between the United States and China, American investment and American trade shifting to countries, to certainly the democratic allies in the region, but even some lesser authoritarian nations like Vietnam. And so it may not be that the full volumes of trade may end up staying somewhat similar. They just may happen to a wider set of players and partners.
So you mentioned sanctions. Western governments use sanctions routinely, right, to get their way. And you talked about the TPP countries creating an improved regime for their trade. Could you see Russia and China creating an alternate universe where sanctioned countries can operate outside the sphere of Western sanctions? I don't know, I guess I could throw that to Rocky. Let's see what.
All right, great. Yeah, not a softball question. Thank you. Really great stuff so far. I would say that the change in global trade patterns is one that I think maybe should elaborate on during the discussion, because I do think the post-COVID-19 world, there's going to be a priority, and it appears to be a bipartisan priority in the United States, to reshore at least certain things, and reshore broadly to mean not depend on China. And so that involves investing in Southeast Asian countries. I would say in addition to Vietnam, also look at Indonesia, India as well. And then to your question, John, I mean, I think that these are the conversations that are happening probably now at the highest levels of government, because what does a sanction look like? Is it taking the Russians out of the SWIFT system, which has huge global implications for commodities trading, for example? If that were to happen, then the incentives for Russia to find a way to work with the Chinese to create that alternate universe that lives outside of Western sanctions or dollarized interdependence. So to move outside of that and create some kind of new mechanism, that incentive goes way up. And I think that that's probably one of the conversations that's happening at the highest levels of U.S. government, that we have the ability to do that, the Russians would pay a heavy price if they were removed, at least in the short term, removed from the SWIFT system. But in the long run, that could accelerate the decline of the dollar being the reserve currency, and that all of a sudden has like second and order consequences that we can talk about if you'd like, but it's major implications for the global economic system, global trade system.
Marina, thoughts on sanctions and their effectiveness?
Well, my thoughts are that they can be effective for a short term, as already mentioned, but as we see, Venezuela, Iran are trading with China and Russia. I mean, they're sending their oil there, and it works for a very short while, as well as the SWIFT. I'm sure they're going to find their way out if they're not already building their own, like we've seen so many payments going outside the SWIFT, especially if you're involved in shipping. You see that there are many other methods that are being used that they're more economical. So they are already being used, and I'm sure that Russia has already built their own systems to fight that. Plus, for Europe, they will really feel the squeeze of any sanctions because now they can turn on and off the tap of gas, since there are so many countries that have gone away from coal, the usage of coal, and they really rely on Russia for their for the gas pipelines there. So, yeah, for the U.S., I can see that for a while they might have their, let's say, their weight put some pressure, but not very effective as it used to be in the past, with the way that everybody's finding methods of going around. For shipping, any type of difficulty, let's say, we saw how COVID and everything else affected the freight rates and the prices in especially in the container market. It boomed after so many years that they were suffering. Again, for shipping, any kind of this type of struggle, it will be positive because they will have to find other ways of trading, longer routes. We'll see again the positive effects, let's say, of this struggle.
So it's interesting, you've touched on a number of these issues involving democracy too, which has been sort of under attack the last few years. And, the movement had been toward democracy for many years after the Cold War. But it seems that the green shoots that came out of Russia certainly have been squashed, and China has eliminated a lot of the democratic reforms that had been implemented for a while. In the U.S., we see increased polarization and left and right very distrustful of one another. So does all this lead to a very unstable international environment, and how does that affect shipping? What do you start with?
Yeah, if I could take that and connect it back to, John, the way that you started the last round, which is, or could we potentially see two parallel systems? I do think that that's possible. That was sort of consistent with the Cold War. The biggest difference is that in that alternative other system, China's in charge, not Russia. They're the far bigger player, not just in terms of population, but size of the economy, and even at some level, the level of sophistication and development in the in the economy. There are certainly high-end pieces of both economies. There's quite a lot of technical know-how on everything from digital technology that we all know and follow, but also hard productive goods, not just energy, but other kinds of manufacturing sectors. But the thing that I would say across that alternative economy, which China has been trying to build through the Belt and Road Initiative, which includes shipping, is what you're getting is an A team and a B team. And the higher value goods will be traded amongst the A team, and the lower value goods will be traded amongst the B team. And we're actually already starting to see that a bit, as I was mentioning, including with the U.S. doing things with respect to China, like the way that they got involved in the decisions around Huawei and 5G. So I do think that that's actually quite possible to emerge. And then going back to the question of Russia, is Russia willing to live with that, willing to live with being the B team player in an alternative system? And that's one of the things that essentially I think Putin and his team, if they're not thinking about, should be thinking about right now.
Marina, thoughts on the instability of the international environment, and whether that could lead to serious effects on shipping as well.
Yeah, as I said before, yeah, I don't know about Russia being the B team. It's from which side of the world you're looking at, from Europe, and from the effect we have from anything that happens with Russia, it's much bigger to us than from China. Although China, because of the Silk Road, yes, that they're building in all the ports around Europe and in Africa, that they have been investing and the infrastructure there, yes, they can have put some pressure. But as far as shipping is concerned, any, as I said, of this type of a struggle that happens, or war, or even sanctions for a while, that would lead to much longer routes, alternative routes, and the result in that has been always that the freight rates definitely go up because of the shortage and of the tonnage. It is the result we have seen always in the cyclicality of shipping. That's what helped actually always the markets, any type of war or sanction that happens.
So slightly afield of this, the OECD continues to pressure small countries to comply with rich country standards in areas such as taxation, governance, environment, transparency. Do you see these offshore jurisdictions that are very popular with ship owners, of course, surviving in the long term in this environment, or would they have to go to the alternate universe? Rocky, you want to try that?
Sure, that's a great question too. I think my mind is spinning with all the different things we're talking about. I think that I think they will survive. Would be my guess. But they'll probably have to adapt. And so how they adapt is a really interesting question. And this does relate to some of the other things we'll talk about later, like the drive for zero carbon shipping and things like that. I think that the trade flows will probably, I think Marina's correct. I think freight rates will go up with instability. And I really do think that you would see disruptions in the shortest routes. So you'd see disruptions through the South China Sea, but there's alternatives. It just requires more ships so that the price gets bid up. And I think the reshoring movement, it's not, for example, in the United States, focusing on just, say, the Americas, which would be a reduction of shipping. It's really, we want to diversify supply chains across the Indo-Pacific. And so that's a huge territory. And I think that in all these different scenarios, I can't think of one where shipping is less relevant, though there may be parts of the world where it's more dangerous to actually proceed. So you'll have to get your war risk insurance or something like that to feel comfortable. And that's its own other conversation. But as far as the different flag states and how they interface with the shipping industry, I think they will probably have to adapt to the new push at the senior international levels. The fact that the oceans were mentioned for the first time in COP26, which just to be showed how sea blind most policymakers are, that the ocean, the key thing makes Earth's climate, was finally mentioned in the climate negotiations after 26 years. But that all the efforts that have been being pushed through by the shipping industry, by parts of the shipping industry with the IMO towards zero carbon shipping or a decarbonization of shipping, how that works, whether it's through ammonia or methanol or some other kind of source of green fuels. I think that's a very interesting conversation, and how the various flag states of the world react to that. And some will see it as an opportunity, some will see it as a threat.
Bill, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I'll give you this through the lens of a couple of companies that I know without naming names, but are shipping dependent. One is that, for major industrial goods that are often really expensive to produce, that have to be shipped within, very heavy, have to be shipped within a country, often by road or rail, shipping might actually become a more attractive alternative as a way of transporting because it's actually carbon lighter to move product. So that's one. The second is what kind of product and whether or not the cost of exporting that product is worth it, or whether you're going to relocate and build abroad. And that's including because of the supply chain disruption. So for instance, the silicon, the semiconductors are environmentally really complicated, right? It is not a super clean business to begin with. They have all kinds of environmental challenges. Given the threats in the Taiwan Strait, the move is to try to produce that stuff onshore in the United States now, as we saw with the opening of the factory in Ohio or in the Midwest last week. And yet there are local ESG concerns about that. So maybe you're not shipping that stuff from Taiwan anymore, but maybe you have to find someplace else that you can build it, where you can navigate around environmental things, and you have to ship it from there to the United States. And that's just one example. So I think every country right now is trying to navigate the combination of, every company right now is trying to navigate the combination of the places where they manufacture and what the environmental rules are there, and how they transport those goods from the given place to the place where they're selling them.
Marina?
Yes, I agree that what we will see is that countries will start looking inside more in order to produce and feel more freedom in their daily operations and their industry operations, because relying, as we said, on Taiwan especially, this is something that we see that it is very hot now, especially with China and how they took over Hong Kong. It's a very big possibility. And the truth is that Taiwan is one of the biggest exporters of electronic parts. And definitely it's something also that we see in Europe, that they are considering what they will do with the production of semiconductors, especially I think Holland, the Netherlands is one of the countries that was always interested in expanding that. But that will have other, implication as far as the ESG is concerned and the environment. But it's definitely something that we see also in shipping, that there are markets that are being built and industries that are being built now inside countries where they can do it, because they see this. I can dare say, it's like we see a reverse of globalization because of the threats that we see that they're building up from either these new dictators that are building up around the world, as you said, that's the democracy bit is fragile, or because of all these tensions that we know.
So Marina, carrying on that thread of the environmental standards, the large banks worldwide, particular Citibank and Societe Generale, came up with the Poseidon principles as standards for environmental compliance to apply to their loans.
Yeah.
Have you seen shipping companies generally complying with them? Are they being integrated generally into shipping?
So the Poseidon principles, they are being incorporated in a few banks' loan agreements, I understand, but the way that shipping is looking at decarbonization has nothing to do with the Poseidon principles per se. It is a way of banks being compliant and being ESG compliant, doing green financing. But what really has to be done there, it comes from the part of the real stakeholders, which are the ship owners, the vessels, the whole line of transportation, because transportation has to do with the trucks, with the ports, and shipping is a part of it. So there are many stages there that have to be followed, and to be that it's not, I will go back again stating that it's not just the Poseidon principles that will make the difference.
Okay, well, The EU has also, and the European Union and the IMO has been trying to get its way of doing things implemented. So you have private sector efforts like the Poseidon Adventure. Poseidon, it certainly is an adventure. The Poseidon Principles, and you also have the governments, EU coming in, and you have international organizations like the IMO as well. How are these all going to play together? And Rocky, I throw it to you first.
Yeah, good question. I think there's a real push, as far as I can tell, to encourage a kind of across stakeholders to encourage the greening of shipping. And different companies are pursuing different strategies. And I think that the big change, so I have a big research project actually on the remote production of green hydrogen. And I think that it's a interesting opportunity for the shipping business, because the best areas to produce green hydrogen from either floating offshore wind or large-scale industrial solar in the world's deserts happen to be far away from the consuming centers, actually quite similar to how LNG and crude oil also have to be transported over large distances. And so I think that what that is causing, the fact that industry players in the energy sector, in the shipping sector, and policymakers all realize that there actually could be some practical solutions on the near horizon that they're not a silver bullet. There's no silver bullets in decarbonization as far as I can tell, but they're a big help. If you had ample, cheap green energy, then all of a sudden the policymakers, the financiers, those advocating the Poseidon Principles, those at the COP would all be aligned that we need to accelerate this transition because we have a cheap alternative. And I'll give you one data point just to encourage the conversation. The Saudis are building a giant solar farm that is reducing the cost of green hydrogen by 50%, so now competitive with liquefied natural gas. And my sense, and I'm kind of new to the green shipping area, is that when the Saudis are on board with green hydrogen at scale, we're going to start to see, which they already are today, we're going to start to see big movements in the energy sector to that. And if you have ample green hydrogen, then all of a sudden ammonia, methanol, which are hydrogen derivatives, become viable. And when you have a viable solution for a green fuel, it's a lot easier for a policymaker to say, let's green shipping, because it's possible and quite practical on the near-term horizon. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I do think that historically, like near history, last 5 years, there have been a lot of people talking about it. And what I've noticed in the last 2 years, and I think COVID helped accelerate this, that people have not only been talking about the policies or the principles or the ESGs, but we're going to try something. We're going to build a ship that's ammonia fueled. We're going to build a ship that's methanol fueled. We need to think about, we're going to work with the Saudis to build green hydrogen at scale and ship it globally. And when you're talking in those ways, all of a sudden we're starting to see what could be a giant opportunity for the shipping sector, because ammonia, as you know, is transporting chemical tankers already. So again, it's like existing technology. So anyway, I think it's just kind of a fun, interesting, timely thing to talk about.
We're running a little short on time, so I didn't want to leave this topic, which is fantastic, but we have interest rates to discuss. So inflation has kicked up again, and anticipating the response would be likely increases in interest rates. Bill, thoughts on that, what you see, and from the government side down there in Washington, and how do you see it affecting trade and shipping?
Sure. Yeah, I think everyone's preparing for the inevitable rise of interest rates in the United States and potentially in Europe. Right now, inflation has been more of a problem in the United States, but it's starting to creep up in Europe as well. I do think that, in that kind of environment, politically, what it leads a government to try to do is to promote exports and be very careful about imports, even more so. So it'll probably reinforce to some degree trade protectionism in the United States. I think that typically happens. I think there's also concern that you might have a slowdown in the, whether or not there's another housing bubble is another question, a real estate bubble, but you would have something of a slowdown in real estate, which is so much affected by interest rates. And then all of the supply chain that goes into construction might slow down as a result. So I think those are the principal things that I tend to pay attention to when I see this kind of thing. I did want to mention one other thing in this context, going back to the conversation about ESG. What you might also see as a result of all of that is something that's quite consistent both with protectionism and addressing ESG goals, and a U.S. interest in raising revenue, particularly if Republicans take the House. One might be interested in, people in the United States might be interested in something that people in Europe are starting to talk about, which are border adjustment taxes for carbon. And if you do that, that has very big protectionist impact, addressing ESG, but potentially, potentially could limit trade or could accelerate trade among countries taking steps to address climate change, as opposed to simply limiting trade. What you could actually then see is a trading network of pro-climate countries versus a trading network of countries that are less climate active.
Marina, quick thoughts on interest rate increases?
Well, yes, it has been a way to monitor, let's say, inflation with the increase of interest rates, and we are expecting to see that in the future, the near future, I should say. But definitely, that will be a negative. That will have a negative effect on the industry, because usually that's what is more affected by the increased interest rate. There's less trade. So I would say that would be the negative effect on the shipping industry. Although we have very positives building up on the other side.
All right, well, I think that should wrap up our main discussion, and we'll take a look at questions from the audience.
All right, that was a great session. Thank you to all three of you. And we are ready to take on some questions. The big one in the news today was Ukraine and Russia again. And President Biden met with the German Chancellor yesterday. The French President Macron met with Putin. There's all sorts of things going on over there. President Biden indicated that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would be shut down if Russia invades Ukraine, but Chancellor Scholz was a little more equivocal, I should say. Could the U.S. hard line end up dividing the West, which is, of course, Putin's goal? And I'll throw that to Bill first.
Well, it is a great question. And yes, of course, it could end up dividing the West, and that would be really quite troubling. I think the critical piece here is, what will the United States do if this is the case in order to assuage German fears and other European fears that the financial costs of a unified front against Russia can be managed within their countries. German public opinion, French public opinion about this is really quite divided. Some see the importance of the solidarity and standing up to Russia as worth the cost. But as we've seen on a number of different issues, including where Europe is much more progressive than the United States, like climate change, rising energy costs tend to divide pretty progressive nations, with some people not wanting to pay the extra cost.
Thanks, Bill. Let's jump to Rocky. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Bill said. I think it has the potential to divide. I think it's a few noteworthy things that weren't in the news today, but were over the last few days, is that we saw cyber attacks in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany against oil tank fields, and that we also saw the Russian Navy its landing craft made it through the Bosporus this morning into the Black Sea. So all of that is, I think, concerning to markets, and that will continue, I think, adding a geopolitical risk premium to both natural gas and oil prices.
Okay, second question. During the finance panel earlier today, one of the speakers discussed how shipping has often done well financially during periods of global tensions. Why is that? And let's throw it to Marina first as our financier here.
Yes, it is true that is happening. And as we said before, it's because usually shipping thrives during these tensions. It is the time that really the freights pick up. And of course, that means also for the financiers that they will have much better repayments, quicker repayments, and because of the freight rates, their cash flows, the loan cash flow works so well that it is a time for them to also follow in the stride of shipping that they're doing well.
Rocky, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the potential for disruption of trade flows, whether it's something happening in the Eastern Med or the Black Sea or something happening in the South China Sea, could create additional demand for a shipping industry that's already stretched fairly quite a bit, and therefore charging rates. And I think that, in addition to the supply chain issues, another thing actually we talked about in my class this morning, noteworthy out of the Olympics in Beijing, the president of Argentina was there reiterating the one China policy, which is Argentina's policy. And China reiterated what I call the one Argentina policy, saying that the Falklands or Malvinas are part of Argentina. And I kind of joked with my class this morning, like, what else can 2022 throw at us? Would a South Atlantic naval dispute? What would that mean for energy prices? I joked it, they're probably not going down. So
maybe a one Mexico policy, and then bring Texas back in there or something. Okay, another question. Is there anything governments can do to resolve the global supply chain issues such as port congestion quickly? Bill?
Yes and no. There are a few simple fixes that every single port needs to do. And that's often a combination of local, state, and federal action, regulatory action. So I think it got a fair amount of attention. The Port of Los Angeles, one of the reasons for the backlog there was local regulations about how high you could stack unused containers. And because you could only stack them so high, and because containers had been offloaded when the shipping was disrupted, you had an oversupply of empty containers that couldn't be stored in the relatively limited space given the height protocols, which were local ordinances. So the federal government would have to come in and get local and state authorities to either waive those ordinances or come up with some other place to put all these shipping containers. And it was just creating a huge mess at that port. So that's potentially something that governments can do. That said, there's limited capacity. And in order to add more capacity or to steer ships to other ports that are underserved, that requires longer-term action and coordination by the federal government. They can eventually do it, but it doesn't happen as quickly as some of us who are waiting for goods to be delivered. I just ordered an electric car. I ordered an electric car from Ford. It's going to be 28 weeks for that car to be manufactured and delivered. And what they say to me is it's supply chain issues. It's manufactured in the United States, but the circuit boards are made in Taiwan, as we discussed before. So when they can get those circuit boards delivered will determine when I get my new Ford Mustang Mach-E.
Nice car.
Yeah, product placement.
Yeah, there you go.
And Ford is not a donor of the Miller Center.
Okay, duly noted. Another question. China's provocations toward Taiwan have been out of the headlines lately. Is this a sign of them backing off, or are they just biding their time? Whoever wants to handle. Marina, any thoughts on China and Taiwan? Rocky.
Well, China seems to always have their own timing schedule. So backing up, maybe they're biding their time, they're preparing, they're waiting to see how Taiwan is reacting to the thought that their neighbors there are in their expansion mood. So yeah, I think we have to be a bit cautious and patient there to see what is going to happen, really.
Rocky?
Yeah, I think that the Beijing Olympics are likely to postpone it, at least in the short term. What happens thereafter, I think, very difficult to predict. I think events in the Black Sea and events in the South Atlantic could also either accelerate or decelerate any time frame for a Taiwan challenge. I generally think that in both Ukraine and in Taiwan, that hybrid war is actually way more effective. And so I actually think that tanks aren't going to roll across a Ukrainian border, but cyber attacks are going to keep happening. Positioning is going to keep happening. Instability is going to keep happening, which again, I think will be good for those who benefit from higher energy prices. And then probably the same in Taiwan, actually, that it'll be more economic, but we'll see. Very unpredictable, which makes maritime geopolitics a fun thing to study.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to a closing statement. Bill, any final thoughts on maritime geopolitics or geopolitics in general?
Well, I think we're all staring at those last set of questions, the crisis that we have, the one in Ukraine, and the crisis that so many people anticipate in the Taiwan Straits are the two most volatile places on Earth. It is fascinating that the crises have moved away from the Persian Gulf, which was a place that 5 years ago we were also focused on and worried about. And I do think that reflects both a tiring, a fatigue of the United States in that part of the world, and a recognition on the part of the United States that these other places are far more important to our core national security interests. And I think that's shared by many of the United States partners, either democratic partners like Israel or monarchical partners like Saudi Arabia. I think there's a desire for a lessening of tensions there, which are so important to maritime trade. But we are now shifting the area of focus, particularly to the east in Asia, but Russia is bringing it back. Shipping is impacted by all of this. It's a global business, and there's no part of the world. It's like a balloon. If you squeeze filled with water, if you squeeze one place, it will surge elsewhere. And I think that, going back 3,000 years to ancient Greece, that was the case back then. If it was in the southeastern part of the Mediterranean at the Nile Delta, or up the Bosphorus, or to the west in around the Italian Boot, there was always a place that was being impacted by where the battlefield shifted. And I think we're just seeing that in the world today.
Marina, final thoughts on where we're headed?
It is a year that began with a lot of tension, but because also the main thing here is the economies that are involved in all this tension. I feel that that we will see some better days, let's put it this way, in geopolitics. And as far as shipping is concerned, I think it's going to be another strong year for all shipping markets.
That's a great positive ending. And Rocky, do you agree?
I agree with that. I was going to, Marina sort of stole my thunder there. I was going to have a positive take. I think that as we emerge from COVID, I think there's a huge opportunity that's going to increase shipping volumes. I think that there are risks, so there's uncertainty. and Bill highlighted those, Taiwan and kind of whatever happens in Ukraine, Black Sea region. I add maybe we could have an Iranian curveball, unlikely, but maybe an Argentinian one. But in all those cases, I think that as the world emerges and that demand for goods, which was suppressed for so long, I think longer than people expected, that we're going to see a boom likely. And we saw that after the 1918 pandemic with the Roaring 20s, and maybe we'll have another Roaring 20s, this time the 2020s. So I'm cautiously optimistic that it's going to be a great year for the shipping markets. And I look forward to the next in-person shipping conference where with lots of sponsors, hopefully nice open bars and things like that. It will be fun to see everybody.
Same here, Rocky. That sounds
well,
great.
You have to come to Posidonia then, and then you will see that.
Right, we're all gearing up. We'll have to reconvene our panel there at a bar. Well, thank you to Marina, Rocky, Bill, for your thoughts and sharing your time with us. And I guess we know that the only certainty is uncertainty going forward. And we'll keep monitoring developments as they come along. So that ends our session. Thank you very
John.
much.
Thank you, Rock. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. See you guys.
Bye.